All right, y'all. Thank you so much for coming today. This is amazing. I love what we have to talk about today. This one was one of the most fun to put together. I love the two questions, which are how do I maintain boundaries when I'm tired and don't have the energy to push back? And what I wrote it was, how do I stop beating myself up for every mistake I make? But the exact question that came in was even better. It was, men don't beat themselves up for their work mistakes while women keep thinking about it and feeling guilty. How can that be avoided? So this one was so fun. I've got it all broken down for you. So we're going to get to both of those questions today. So why are we here? We're here for, I don't know, episode 5 of It's Not Just You. But the whole reason for this being created was all of the questions that I get. I've spoken at over 50 different companies over the past year, and I get questions that come in. And now we start to get questions too. If you ever want to submit them to have them answered on this, you can go to unboundedunbothered.com, and then it's ask dash Gretchen, which I should just change so that it doesn't have a dash. So it's just better. But that's what's going on. The questions come up a lot, and they come together around perfectionism and burnout, setting and maintaining boundaries, finding and actually using your voice, and then how to get it all done and still be a functioning human being and not a robot. So the goal of this is to give candid answers. Like, I don't have an employer now who I have to worry about what I say, right? I can just be really honest. And I've spent 25 years in tech. I've seen much of it, and I understand what women in male dominated industries are going through. And I can talk about it very openly, which is liberating, I must say. But I really want everyone to understand that, especially working with the clients that I do, I hear the other side of it. And we all think that everyone else has it together, and we don't. And that's just not true. We are all just barely holding it together and keeping it, if you think about, I always like to describe it as we're all ducks on a pond and we're all furiously paddling underneath while gliding gracefully above the water, right? But we just look around and we see all those other gracefully gliding ducks, and we think, oh, I'm the only one who's doing these bananas things. So quickly, a little bit of housekeeping. So we have a masterclass coming up. I just launched it. It's coming up next month on the 16th, but this one is called Harness Your Inner Critic and Mastering Self-Advocacy. So if that's of interest, you want to get that, Amy will drop the link in the chat on the Zoom, and we'll put it in the link for the live stream later. And then if you have any comments that are going to come up, you're in the Zoom, and if you're watching live right now on a different, on Facebook or LinkedIn, you can come, there's a link in somewhere in here in a graphic to come join us on the Zoom, because we're going to do some networking at the end. So drop your comments. I love a lively chat. If we can chat live too. We've got a small enough group today. So if you just want to chime in, Tracy, it's awesome to see you and that you made it today. And yeah, and then we'll have a document, and Amy can drop that link too, where you can do an ask and offer. So you can add yourself to this, and we just have a collective ongoing ask and offer, because I feel like this community has so much, just this really specific type of high achieving badass women that really need to know more of each other. And so that's what we're doing in this. Okay, let's dive into all the amazingness. Question 1, how do I maintain boundaries when I'm tired and I don't have the energy to push back? This one comes up a lot, right? I think most people can relate to it. So what's going on is, if you think about the nervous system, I talk a lot about the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses, but there's actually a fifth called a flop response. And this is essentially where your body thinks that the only way to survive is to play dead, right? If you think about animals that have a dangerous predator and they just totally freeze, right? They might be a freeze response, but they might play dead until the threat has passed. And this is kind of what's going on in your brain. You're so overwhelmed. You've been so overwhelmed. You're so exhausted that your brain's just like, nah, we're done. And so it's a way of dealing with trauma. And we talk about the flop response a lot in like big T trauma discussions, but even like a little T trauma type of discussion of, I just don't have anything more to give anyone today. This is why I can't maintain my boundaries. But your body thinks there's just no chance of winning or escaping. So it's just like, forget it. And because your body or your brain thinks there's no chance of winning, that's why we don't think there's any point in speaking up and maintaining the boundary, because it just feels like it's going to take energy that I don't have, and it's not going to change anything anyway. Because if we just said, used words and said, hey, but you should take the garbage out, right? That would be very different. But sometimes we're just like, I don't want the whole discussion that follows that. I don't want to have that same argument again over it. And so there's another little piece of psychology that I think is really relevant here. It's a concept called ego depletion. And that says that this idea that our self-control and willpower, you hear this come up a lot with the idea of, like, I don't want to get into diet talk, but it will come up a lot in that idea, right? Like where our willpower and our ability to have any amount of self-control draws upon a limited pool of mental resources, and when they're exhausted, then we don't have the ability to have self-control or make decisions. Literally, our decision-making ability is diminished because if you think about the nervous system, it floods your body with adrenaline and cortisol. It sends blood flow to your limbs so that you can run when you're being chased by a lion, except that our threats are predominantly in the modern era of psychological threats, but your body's doing the same thing. And so, of course, you have less blood in your brain to make some clear decisions, to really think about it. So that's kind of what's going on, like physiologically. What's going on socialization wise is we've basically people pleased our way into the flop response. We feel so responsible for other people's comfort. We get so much validation when we are selfless and giving. We get so much positive feedback and so much appreciation that we don't get if we put ourselves first. And then, of course, we don't ever want to be seen as selfish. So we end up giving and giving until we have nothing left to give ourselves, including the thing that we would give ourselves in this moment is to maintain the boundary and hold other people accountable. But it makes sense, of course, that we would do that. If our validation only comes from other people, we don't get like a you go girl when we sat around and watched Netflix all day. Although, I mean, I tell myself that obviously I needed to rest, but we don't get that validation. We're not getting, there's no movies made about the heroic woman who watched like the whole season 3 of Bridgerton or whatever. Yeah, Ash is such a people pleaser over here. And it's so not a reliable way of finding worth. No, it's not, because then you're totally, if you're not learning to look inward for the answer of, am I worthy? Am I valuable? Then of course it's going to be a thing where we're like, well, the only way that I get my cookies, my validation cookies, is if I go do the things for the other people and then they tell me I'm good and then I get to believe them and I get to feel good. And if we don't do that, or if you're socialized the way that most women are in a patriarchal society to put other people's needs above your own, or you're selfish, right? Like, of course, all of this is going to happen. Yeah. So the thought that often comes up that we talk about a lot in some of the other masterclasses and stuff that I do is I should say no, but it's easier to just do it myself, right? You're just like, the path of least resistance is just for me to do one more thing today, even though so-and-so should be doing it. So the feelings that can come up in this, particularly in the kind of when we're taking it to the extreme and calling it a flop response, is that you feel hopeless that there's any support. Your optimism is completely diminished. You don't think that there's any way that anyone's going to help you with this. You're angry at the person that is pushing or ignoring your boundaries. And sometimes we're not even expressing those, right? We kind of turn it inward and we beat ourselves up thinking, well, if I would have just said something, and somehow we take the blame for them not respecting boundaries or doing, whatever they've agreed to do. And then on top of all of that, on top of the hopelessness and the anger and the frustration, it's compounded by blame and shame because we start thinking we're the problem. Oh, I must be the problem because I didn't tell them that the boundary existed, or I didn't remind them that whatever. So on top of everything else, we're blaming and shaming ourselves. So it's this really, really, and that of course is going to make you more tired. Bless you, Rebecca. That's going to make you even more tired, right? It's going to put even more like a cycle into it, right? Because the blame and shame is going to wear you down too. So, yeah, Tracy said resistance is sometimes futile. Yeah, I mean, it really can feel that way. And sometimes, this isn't a thing that we want to solve when we're tired. This isn't a thing that we want to try to deal with when we're exhausted, right? This is a thing that we want to make a plan for it first thing in the morning, right? Of like, how am I going to do this thing so that I don't get depleted, so that I'm not, how do I remind people about my boundaries, or what am I going to do in the situation where like it's Thursday and the garbage cans aren't being taken to the curb again, right? Like whatever the situation is, just you want to do that when you're feeling refreshed and stronger. Okay, here's the kind of the behaviors that result from this. Of course, we worry about being selfish and we prioritize everyone's needs above our own, and we give and we give until there's nothing left. We have nothing left to enforce our boundaries. Of course, we do that. Of course, by the time we reach the end of the day, we have nothing left in the tank because we don't get validated and praised for taking care of ourselves. Of course, we shame ourselves as if it's our fault that other people don't respect our boundaries or acknowledge our needs because we didn't do it right. This is a very common, it must be my fault always, right? And so, in some ways I can see that as like a coping mechanism. Like I used to do that because it felt like, then it made me feel like I was in control. Like, oh, if it's my fault, then I can fix it, right? And you kind of have to find the balance in there of, wait, but I'm taking responsibility for things that are absolutely not my issue. All right. So the outcomes, the kind of what these behaviors that are resulting from these feelings that are resulting from this belief system that we've been handed is we say yes when we mean no because we don't want to be seen as selfish or unlikable. We let folks violate our boundaries and don't hold them accountable because we're too exhausted to speak up. And then when we don't speak up and it goes and it goes and it goes, and we lash out or we shut down, and then what comes back in? The blame and shame for like letting it all come back to it. Ashley just, you guys can't see it, but she just mouthed shame. Like, yes, absolutely. And so we end up in this cycle of ego depletion and flop, and it's hard to recover from that and create no outcomes. So I have a few thoughts that you can kind of, I just said, get me off this vicious hamster wheel. Yes. Yes, it's brutal. But the thing is like that's the whole reason I love doing these talks, because I want to break it down so you can see here's where it starts. And there's all these places where it can keep all these ways that we can interrupt it, right? Like we can plan for it. We can be like, oh, this is me people pleasing because that's a survival technique because I was told this, but I don't believe that anymore. And you can start rewiring your brain. Or when you start feeling obligated, you can stop and be like, now, why do I feel obligated about this? Or when you find yourself doing the thing for the 50th time, I wonder why I'm doing this, right? Like there's so many opportunities when you understand where it starts and all the steps. There's so many ways where we can interrupt it without blame and shame, without any sort of, oh, there I am doing it again, right? Like we don't, it's just like, oh, there it is. Okay, well, I found it. And you'll find it earlier and earlier. And then you'll find yourself, it's much easier to stop doing those things. And when you stop doing some of them, you get to take that energy and go for the next round of things that are more difficult to deal with. Okay, so these are my tips. There's that one. I deserve care too. And I'm actually going to talk about that is like one of my thoughts that I worked on for a really long time. Okay, so talking about the people pleasing that I was doing, I started off with an idea of like, I wanted to get to, I always prioritize my needs. But I really had to start with something like humans deserve care. I'm human. I deserve care too. And then I deserve care, right? And then I am learning how to prioritize my needs. And then I moved to I prioritize my needs, and then I always prioritize my needs. And so this was over probably 6 months. I would work on this thought for a while. I have them on sticky notes around my house in places where I'll notice them. So I'm thinking them on a, like there's always the one in the bathroom, and that's just one. And that's always my big thought that I'm working on. Right. And then once I realized that, like, I don't feel anything when I think that thought anymore. There's nothing in me that disagrees with it. I realize like, oh, now I believe this and I can move on to the next thing. But part of this was also like this idea of I put all my lists of like stuff I need to do, things that I don't really enjoy doing. But I was like, if I enjoy doing things for other people and I like having things done for me, then if I do things for me, then I get to feel good. Like it just like my head exploded. I think I sent it to Amy and Amy was like, what? And her head exploded too. I'm just like, what just happened? But it was this idea. And then I renamed my task list of the things I didn't want to do. You deserve care. And then every time I had to do it, I thought, oh, I'm taking care of myself, right? And so I was able to put into action also what I was working on with thoughts. But I love to give those little tidbits of something that I worked really, really, really hard on. But being able to set and maintain boundaries with my family came from this because I was always like dropping everything and taking off or like bending over backwards, moving heaven and earth for like something that actually wasn't that important to them, and then resenting them because it's like, I'm the best sister and the best daughter and the best auntie in the world. Why does no one appreciate like what, and it's like, nobody asked you to do that. And so it just became, of course, I want to do all those things, but not to the detriment of my own needs. So that's kind of the journey, the behind the scenes of that one. Okay. So question 2, I love this question. Men don't beat themselves up for their work mistakes while women keep thinking about it and feeling guilty. How can that be avoided? Okay, so there's several little pieces to this. So we always start with talking about what's going on with our nervous system. So this is a fight response that we have, but instead of punching someone else in the face, we're punching ourselves in the face. We start beating ourselves up. This is the response to a threat. Our brain's like, let's put the inner critic into super overdrive. And then we get ourselves back in that shame spiral that we were just talking about with the shouldas and the couldas and the wouldas. You should have done this. If only you could have, whatever, if you would have done this, right? Like all of the shoulds and coulds and woulds, we call them around here the Oda triplets, and we're trying to cancel them. But that comes in and then it creates shame and regret, and it makes it even scarier to make a mistake in the future because we're afraid of that. We're afraid of what we're going to think if we make a mistake and how crappy we're going to be to ourselves. And so when we start shaming ourselves, then we go in to a freeze response of shame and doubt. And we also go into a freeze response of self-doubt. Like all of the criticism in our heads makes us doubt ourselves. And then we don't try. So this one's really, really deep when we talk about how much men or how much women beat themselves up. Okay. So the socialization. So of course, we always talk about if our validation comes from others and we're not getting any validation cookies, if we're not looking inward for the answer of, am I doing a good job? Am I worthy? When we're looking for that answer outside of ourselves, of course, we're going to beat ourselves up for mistakes because then we don't get our cookies, right? There's another piece that I don't think I've talked about in this forum yet. So in girl and boy social groups, in boy social groups, and these are both starting around the age of like 4 or 5, right? In boy social groups, this isn't a surprise, right? Competition over cooperation. There's an alpha. They're constantly competing and sort of jockeying for that position. What that does is builds emotional resilience. It makes it like you get used to losing in essence. You can't always be the alpha, but you have to compete because that's how you become part of the group. Otherwise, you might be called a girl, right? So you have to compete to be part of this, but you get used to losing. You get used to making mistakes. It builds emotional resilience. So if we take that in contrast with a girl social group, well, humbleness is valued over confidence and cooperation over competition. Yeah, of course. Like, one, we don't build the emotional resilience because we pretend like there is no competition, even though sometimes there is, right? And we're also really keeping our sisters in check on their humbleness. So I want to give you an example. So say you're like a 12-year-old girl sitting around at a slumber party and you say, I'm so pretty. And you can think about like, Like everyone might agree in the moment, but you know that something's going to be, something's going to happen. She's going to be she's not saying she's prettier than anyone else. She's not even being competitive, right? But they're still like, oh, but you got to be humble. And it's not like anyone's even aware that this is happening, but this is what's happening. So if there's a problem, if you are like express confidence and you can't be competitive, then how do you build the emotional resilience to ride through mistakes? This is why Chad gives zero fucks when he like makes a huge mistake. Chad does not care. Chad is not weighed down by this, right? Chad's just like, yeah, it's Wednesday and rolls right on through. But this is why when we look at what we would very broadly paint as a brush of how women as a large category would handle this versus men. You have to think about the socialization. Think about if you'd started from 5 years old of like, you're going to fail all the time and it's not going to mean anything, how much different you would approach this now. Okay. So the feelings that come up. Okay. Anger that's directed inward. So you're tearing yourself down. And here's the thing, that inner critic, if like no one else would be, speaking only for myself, allowed to speak with me the way that I used to speak to myself and still sometimes do. I mean, like I would not be able to guarantee her safety. I'd be like, I give you 5 seconds to get out of my, like, the length of my arm so that there's not going to be any like pain that's inflicted on you physically. But that's the way that we speak to ourselves every day, that like, any day that ends in Y, essentially. Right. And so that creates shame. We feel small, we feel incapable. That creates self-doubt. Then we stop taking risks. And over time, that means we quit before we ever even start. And that's really the part that we want to interrupt. So when we think about the behaviors, like, of course we worry we're going to make a mistake. We don't get any validation because we're not looking inward. Of course, we're afraid to take risks because we're so afraid of how awful it's going to feel when we should, could, and would all over ourselves when it doesn't work out. And of course, we ruminate when we haven't had a lifetime of socialization to build emotional resilience. Asha said, I literally can't even imagine, but it's so validating to hear. It's something we're socialized from a young age to believe. Thank goodness for neuroplasticity. Exactly. Exactly. I mean, and this is the thing, that the tip that I'm going to give you in a minute is actually, it's like 100% around building emotional resilience. So before we get to that though, I just want to talk about the outcomes. So we become fearful, but we're fearful of ourselves. And that sounds shitty, but it's back to that control idea. Like, great, then we can agree, we can learn skills to have our own backs, no matter what the outcome is, right? Like we're 100% in control. And then if no one's going to like should, could, and would all over you, if no one's going to like make you feel more humiliated and more whatever, then you are free to try and fail at anything at any time. And then you're just going to feel that initial sting of like, oh, I'm disappointed, or oh, I'm embarrassed, or oh, I'm whatever. And it lasts 60 to 90 seconds. Physiologically, that's how long an emotion like that lasts if you don't start beating yourself up. So you can all just go put on a freaking cape right now, right? Like you can create that freedom. You can be a superhero that can do anything and withstand anything, because 60 to 90 seconds of humiliation, and it might come up several times over a few days. Like I've definitely had that. I've given talks at companies where like crickets. And I'm like, and I've tried so hard to get some engagement and like nothing in the chat or whatever. And I just feel so embarrassed afterwards. And it's going to go past. Like, who knows what's going on? I can't make it mean something about me. It just means that like on this day at this company, there just weren't a lot of people who were enthused or wanting to participate in the ways that I would make it mean that they were interested. Okay. So we also get stuck at that blame and shame cycle that keeps us at the starting line, or we quit before we even start. Like how many times have you talked yourself out of asking for more money or raising your hand for that big project? We for sure aren't going to be successful at it if we don't even try. And then the last page is outcome that we have is we make mistakes mean something about us, our future, our ability, but Chad doesn't. And so we want to borrow just a little bit of Chad sometimes and just be like, what would Chad do? Chad would be like, sorry, made a mistake. Where's my raise? Right. Actually said freaking Chad. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so here's my tip. Do a dare of the day. So this is the way to build emotional resilience. And it can be just, it's so low stakes. Like ride an elevator or an escalator backwards, right? Get on the, I don't know, the BART here in the Bay Area, right? Get on the bus and just face everyone awkwardly, right? There's these ways that you can build them. It'll feel terrible. And then when you're done, you're like flooded with all of those, but then you're really excited and proud of yourself, right? And what we want to do is find these low stakes interactions. Like if singing karaoke seems like the most terrifying thing in the world, then go do that. But it has to be something that genuinely scares you. Like for me, the scary thing, I haven't done it yet, is to send back food with no explanation. Like I can't even send it back with an explanation. Yeah, Ash was like, I couldn't either. Right. And then, of course, leave a really big tip. But for me, that's just, it's the one where I'm like, that would scare the living shit out of me. I would feel so anxious. Right. Or go and, ask someone for $1 in like inside a store, like in Walmart or something. Right. Like just go, but do something that scares you like every single day. And what you'll do is you'll build emotional resilience. And then when the bigger things come up, you're like, and you're just sort of used to that, like adrenaline and cortisol and everything else that's in your body. I have another client right now. So she's super confident. It's not, and she's pretty resilient, but she has to fight these urges that she has for like having control over everything, to just let things go. And so she practices with things like, I'll let my husband pick the restaurant we're going to and not ask. And then choose to have a good time when I get there. Right. And so for her, the resilience is in giving up control and letting her body and her mind slowly learn that she's not going to die if she's not in charge of everything. Because when she's in charge of everything, then she's freaking tired all the time and she sort of resents the people in her life. Right. So that's my way. Just think about these ways of like low stakes ways. Like all she's going to do is end up having dinner at a restaurant that she didn't want to go to, right? Not a big thing, but find these low stakes things to build that and make it a daily practice. All right. So Kelsey said, that's me. Yeah. The control part, Kelsey. Yeah, probably. Okay. So that's it. So for folks on the live stream, we're kicking you out now. Go to that link that's in somewhere in the thing, and we're going to end this stream, and then we're going to do fun networking here without you. So you should get over here.